This is the Unit 3 recap for AP African American Studies. Brief overview of Unit 3 primarily focuses on the end of the Civil War and how we transitioned from slavery to segregation and what that process was like prior to the Civil Rights Movement. The unit begins with Reconstruction, or the period after the Civil War, where the federal government, along with the radical Republicans, put in place mechanisms designed to deal with the end of slavery as we transition to the post-Civil War period. This slide is a brief overview looking at the Slave Convention and the time period where the Civil War takes place up until the point where we get to the 1876 Compromise, which is where you see a series of black codes. As it mentions down here, that is where segregation really starts to begin. The Reconstruction Amendments are passed after the Civil War and are designed to deal with the post-slavery transition. 13th Amendment ending slavery, the 14th Amendment doing a couple of things. One, defining citizenship and arguing that states are not allowed to deprive people of certain rights without due process. The 15th Amendment guaranteeing voting rights. The post-Civil War period is also dealing with the reunification of former slaves, friends, and families. You have the federal government getting involved in creating the Freedmen Bureau, and the Freedmen Bureau is going to be a federal government agency dealing with the transition as well as the protection, making sure that the Southern and local governments are following the 13th through 15th Amendments, as well as dealing with that process of marriage and other items that are in Unit 3. As it says here that they are establishing a Freedmen Bureau. The South, from their point of view, they're looking at all of this federal legislation as a overreach by the federal government. And this map, we see the South cut into military districts, and this is an example of the federal government trying to make sure that those amendments and that the post-Civil War period is ending, and states, local governments, former slave owners are complying with primarily the 13th Amendment. Now, the South being cut into these military districts is really going to lead to some anger and resentment that they're going to direct toward the federal government as they try to find loopholes around this legislation, which is what this image here is trying to address. The federal government is passing legislation, for example, those 13th through 15th Amendments, and the goal with this loophole that the local and state governments of the South are going to try to employ going to be to try to find ways around those three amendments. So those Reconstruction Amendments are important to understanding eventually how we get to segregation. You can also think of this as a back and forth. The federal government does something. In this case, they pass those three amendments, and then the state governments are going to respond to try to figure out a way around those legislative pieces. The Republicans, radical Republicans, are going to be the ones implementing some of these changes. And here we have one of those required sources looking at the participation of African American legislatures during the Reconstruction period. We then transition to the Black Codes. This activity was a class assignment where students were asked to work in groups to try to figure out what could be done after the Civil War with the freeing of the slave population. What should be the short-term, long-term action that could potentially change the circumstances, what resources would be needed, and then of course to come up with a justification for those decisions. Trying to develop some sort of solution to the post-Civil War climate, we're going to see various issues where former slaves are going to be put into sharecropping, crop liens, and convict leasing, and this could be viewed as another example of indirect slavery, but the question here is whether or not it acts as a loophole. Does it comply or not comply with that 13th Amendment, which outlaws slavery? And that's kind of what this question here is asking you, that these mechanisms, because at the end of the day, the South really does not want to comply with those amendments. Again, they're going to view those three amendments as an example of overreach by the federal government. And we have the Reconstruction Amendments, and again, the goal by the local and state governments of the South is to try to figure out a way around these particular federal amendments. Mainly this one right here is the one that's going to get us to segregation. Some of the other solutions after the post-Civil War period, granting the freedmen 40 acres and a mule. That way they can go out and provide for their own survival. Again, without any of these economic resources, what is going to happen when you let the former slave free? If they don't have any economic resources, the education, that's going to be key to understanding the circumstances that are going to impact this group later on. Circular number 8, again, it's looking at the Freedmen Bureau, looking at abandoned lands. The Freedmen Bureau, this is a federal government agency, which means the federal government is passing this agency. They're the ones coming up with this piece of legislation. And again, from the state governments of the South, they're going to view this as overreach by the federal government, which then leads to a series of segregation laws, and the segregation laws that are going to be passed that are going to act as a potential way around or a loophole around that 14th Amendment. And throughout this unit, we're going to definitely be looking at the tension between the local state fighting against the federal government. And at this point, we're looking again at those 13th through 15th Amendments that the local and state governments are going to want to try to figure out a way around. The defeat of Reconstruction, this is where we get to segregation with a series of laws known as the Black Codes. The Black Codes get us to segregation. If you do not remember in Unit 2, the Slave Codes is what got the United States into permanent involuntary hereditary servitude. And the Black Codes get us to segregation with the outcome of the Plessy versus Ferguson court case decision. If you're not familiar, this is the one that allows separate but equal. They are not telling the person that he cannot get on the train. They are simply saying that you need to get into the cart designated for your race. So he still kind of gets to his destination. The only difference is that he has to sit in the cart. So this is not a violation of his rights because he still gets to the destination. You start to then see more segregation laws, and ultimately these laws will be challenged through the civil rights movement. Coming back to the map that was referenced before, the South is trying to obtain home rule. When you look at the Compromise of 1876, the election between Hayes and Tilden, the agreement is going to lead to the removal of these military districts, which is going to lead to the South being able to have home rule to determine how they resolve the race issue. You're going to see a wave of violence in Unit 2. Here we have Ida B. Wells, who was working in the early 1900s to end the practice of lynching. Here we have a source by Ida B. Wells talking about that practice. We looked in class at segregation and how segregation is requiring following of state laws. We looked at this particular restaurant to try to figure out, as a restaurant owner, how would you comply with this particular law that's requiring you, if you are selling food to both races, that you have to divide up your restaurant. Now keep in mind, if you split it like this, there could be an argument that this is actually not equal because we do not have the same amount of chairs in this area that we do here. So you would have to try to figure out a way to separate this restaurant because it's asking you to have a solid partition from the floor. And again, this is an example of the segregation laws that are going to be put in place by, again, the state governments. We then transition to some of the leaders, and by the time you get to the late 1800s, early 1900s, you're going to see African Americans coming forward, demanding change, demanding progress, but they all have different strategies and approaches. For example, Ida B. Wells, primarily concerned with the violence. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a series of essays, was an activist, leading one of the founding members of the NAACP, and he came up with the idea of double consciousness. We transitioned to looking at some of the violence, looking at Tulsa, the burning of Black Wall Street that was prompted by a potential elevator attack. And we looked at some of the images, the visuals from the Tulsa massacre. This is an example of physical. Unit 3 continues to introduce students to different leaders. Booker T. Washington, Du Bois. Booker T. Washington born a slave, whereas Du Bois was born free, and that may or may not impact how they viewed the racial problem and solutions in this country. Du Bois comes up with double consciousness, and we looked at this where you're pretty much having two identities. He knows what it means to be black in America, yet he is told that he is an American. So you have these two identities What does it mean to be an American? But then what does it mean to be a Black American? In this particular source, he knows that he's different when he gives this card to a little girl and she refuses it. At that point, he knows that he is different. King, letter from a Birmingham jail. I know this is a big jump here, but the only reason why this source is being here because Dubois and King talk about how people are going to respond to their circumstances. Are they going to adjust? Are they going to become insensitive? Or are they going to have a bitterness and hatred? But for Dubois, writing in the early 1900s, he wanted to try to beat white at everything he potentially can. If he's in a class, he needs to be smarter. If he's in a race, he needs to be faster. We looked at some of the images from Tulsa using this particular website. Then we transitioned to the next part, which is looking at Black institutions, lifting as we climb. We started out with the question, what should Black Americans do to change their situation in America? This is in an ideal world where everything counts. And then we started looking at some of the other sources, Booker T. Washington, Booker T. Washington looking at how they need to simply continue asking, which a potential problem would be, well, if you're going to ask white America to solve your problems, what are they willing to give you? Here he writes, cast down your bucket where you are. He's concerned with being a mechanic, being a domestic servant, and for people like Dubois, they just felt that that wasn't enough, that they shouldn't be primarily working class laborers. This section also starts to look at the suffrage movement, and the suffrage movement is crucial because we start to see Black women coming forward and looking at intersectionality, where it might be one thing to be a Black male in America, but it may be another thing to be a Black female in America. And we looked at the same thing during the slavery time period when we're looking at rape and sexual assault. Is the experience of Black women different from Black men? As we do a quick recap, we address the end of the Civil War. What do you do now? The local, state versus federal government, how the South has achieved home rule, who is going to comply with change. People are just not going to follow those amendments, follow the legislation that's designed to protect the rights of the African American, the Black American, and those individuals possibly will result in violent actions. And then we start looking at the different approaches to solving the race problem. We already looked at Booker T. Washington, Ida B. Wells, and then we go back to some of the sources that are talking about intersectionality. Anna Julia Cooper. Here we see the overlap between those three issues, race, class, and gender. And that's what these sources are about, looking primarily at the unique experience of Black women. Lift every voice and sing. We're looking at this particular section here, which is looking at the darkness and how there's potentially always a light at the end of the tunnel. We looked at this during Unit 2 as well, dealing with some of the brutalities of slavery and how slaves maintain a positive mindset and how they managed to sing and use religion as a way to kind of hope for a better day. We come to this slide here. How should African Americans and Black Americans respond to their situation? Because at this point in the course, we're starting to see various approaches. Is it possible to ask the local and state governments? We already know that those state governments want home rule. Can you ask the federal government? How much have you asked the federal government? Keep in mind that the federal, local, and state are at odds with each other. And in that climate, some people will probably just give up. Some are going to want economic change. Some are going to want to use Black excellence. Some want to redefine themselves, which is what is going to lead to the evolution of the new Negro. We transitioned to HBCUs, where we looked at historically Black colleges and the separate Black institutions that were being created, Black churches, Black cemeteries, Black banks, and we start looking at historically Black colleges, where is it the solution to just kind of create two Americas, one white and one Black. We looked at the Second Morrill Act, which was a federal government piece that was designed to put aside federal money. However, you could not be discriminatory at the college level if you were going to accept federal money. So the federal government is willing to give you money, but you cannot have colleges that are going to be, primarily for one race. We looked at some of the photographs from the AP framework, and here we have the Jubilee Singers. We looked at this particular clip here where it talked about how the Jubilee Singers were going out and singing to try to challenge some of the stereotypes that the majority of America possibly may have with regard to how they see African Americans. Some images of African American college students. Then we transitioned to photography and poetry, where we looked at primarily the work of James Van Der Zee and how he wanted to portray a positive image of African Americans. Here we see Black Americans being portrayed by white actors, being viewed in some pretty nasty racist caricatures, Jim Crow, the work of Stepin Fetchit, which possibly may be an example of somebody portraying a black actor in a negative light. And this section is all about challenging that particular viewpoint. Here we see some images from James Van Der Zee where he's trying to capture the black experience in a positive light as opposed to the negative that seems to be the norm for this period. Here we have some more images. Here we see this poem Heritage, and the key part here is this section here with this minstrel smile, which is a reference to the blackface. And again, it's about challenging the negative perception of Black Americans. Here we have another source, and what's different about this source is that they are starting to look at Africa and trying to make a connection between the negative portrayal of African Americans, Black Americans, and how possibly re-examining Africa and identifying something positive out of the African experience. If we go back to Unit 1 where we looked at the Dark Continent, it's about looking back at that, and if you can view Africa as a source of pride, that might potentially change how you view yourself. We looked at the Cabin in the Sky trailer, an all-black cast, and again, it's about trying to portray African Americans in the positive as opposed to a negative light. We looked at these various clips here that are kind of on that theme, going back to the 1970s, the 1980s, and then even present day with the Netflix trailer for the show Good Times, which was criticized for its negative portrayal, which is what this particular unit here was about. We then transitioned to the New Negro Movement. Brief timeline. We started out with the Civil War. The South was able to get home rule. They then reinforced their home rule with federal legislation by the Plessy-Ferguson decision. And at that point, you started to see a wave of violence against African Americans. And then World War I led to the Exodus with the Great Migration, and then you started to see more violence to continue. Great Migration map, the exodus from the South to some of those cities, and then we start to see more scholars coming forward making different arguments with regard to how the racial issues should be resolved. For example, Du Bois talking about education being the key. If we look at the work of Marcus Garvey and his Back to Africa movement, these definitely represent two different views. This individual is staying, and this individual is going to leave. The New Negro Movement, it's looking at how we could potentially change the image, the perception. What can we do as a group of people to try to challenge and change that perception? Here we have yet another individual, Alan Locke. Langston Hughes criticizing or bringing up the issue of, what does it mean to be a poet versus what does it mean to be a black poet, and how that could potentially translate to what does it mean to be an artist versus what does it mean to be a black artist. It could even apply for actors. What does it mean to be an actor versus a black actor? Black history education. So we're going back to this slide here, and again, some of the possible responses to dealing with the race problem in America. We already looked at moral suasion. They already have physical freedom, but they don't have physical protection. Do we just redefine ourselves? Are we going to become black nationalists? You have these different ideas, different solutions, which is what this song that we looked at, You Must Learn by Boogie Down Productions from the 1980s, where it's looking at that same idea. So it's interesting to point out that in the early 1900s, people are making that case, and then by the time it gets to the 1980s, you have rap artists making a similar claim that if you teach black history, that might change the perception of self, and that might lead to progress and change. Not much different from this source here. The Negro Digs Up His Past, and the title I think says enough. It's about looking back to what does it mean to be African? What does it mean to be African American, and dealing with those two ideals? I've included this slide here because this slide is a survey result of the AP African American Studies course, and what, according to this survey, people felt comfortable and uncomfortable with teaching. They're comfortable with the civil rights movement being taught, but as you kind of talk about more things, black conservatism, black feminism, and things like intersectionality, support for teaching these ideas and these historical facts become less supported. Study of the Negro in this piece, it's looking at the miseducation of the Negro, and again, it's making a similar point that if we learn our history, that might change the way we view ourselves, the way we behave, the way we interact, and the way ultimately that the majority of society sees us. Is that the solution? Continuing on with that Great Migration, looking at World War I, and the main point here is that while African Americans are fighting in segregated units and they're being told that they're fighting for freedom abroad, they're being denied freedom in the United States, and that hypocrisy is going to be examined. Industrial nation during war, whereas black Americans are fighting in segregated units or are only allowed in labor-related tasks in the military. That's going to lead to some challenges later on, especially during World War II. We're going to see some protests regarding inequality by A. Philip Randolph, who is eventually going to be one of those organizations called CORE during the Civil Rights Movement. So a quick recap here. We went from the Civil War, we addressed World War I, and this violence period here, which would be the lynchings, Tulsa, and things like that, is what's going to prompt that Great Migration. Lynching is going to remain a constant throughout the early 1900s. The Dyer Bill, which would be an example of federal legislation designed to stop the practice of killing of black Americans. Keep in mind that this piece does not get passed. Image of the Great Migration, the exodus from the south to those northern cities. And then we start to see some Caribbean migration to the United States. The late 1800s, where the United States, after the Spanish-American War, gains access primarily to the Western Hemisphere. Is that going to allow for migration from these areas to the United States? Now, if we go back to the Middle Passage, most of the slaves were sent to these areas. So you do have some Africans that are in these regions, but if they go here, how are they going to be perceived? Is it one thing to be African American? Does it mean another to be a black American? What if I am a Jamaican American? Then you throw in the other issue of being an immigrant, and how is that going to be viewed and perceived in the United States? Marcus Garvey is going to be one of the advocates for the returning back to Africa, a black nationalist type concept. Here we have some Caribbean advocates that are trying to question the difference here and looking at these various groups here, and the sources are going to look at Indian migration and how that might potentially impact the situation that is being experienced by Caribbean blacks, which is what's being outlined in this particular source here. It's questioning some of the policies with regard to movement. In this slide here, we're looking at the pros and cons of the strategy. We're about to transition to Marcus Garvey, and we're looking at Marcus Garvey, who is a early 1900 leader who has definitely a different approach from Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. So to quick recap here, Unit 3 is about the end of the Civil War, primarily how we transition to segregation with the tension between the local, state, federal governments. Once we have those 13th through 15th Amendments passed, you're going to see some violence, which is going to lead to different leaders emerging, and those different leaders have different approaches to solving the race problem. You're going to see continued migration, primarily from the Western Hemisphere, and then that is going to change in America, primarily for Americans that are in the United States prior to the migration, because at the end of the migration, how does somebody know the difference between an African American, African American who has just arrived, or a Caribbean, a Jamaican, or a Haitian, in the grand scheme of things, some people are going to view all of those individuals as just one lump group. You're all black. But there are differences within those groups, and that's going to be the end of Unit 3 before you transition into Unit 4, where this issue will reemerge.